In this video, we're going to cover API gateway. API gateways are used in pretty much every system design, as when you have microservices, they are an essential. In this video, we're going to cover what an API gateway is, what it actually does, and how to deploy and scale it. API gateways are the single entry point into your microservices environment. The clients will hit the API gateway, and then the API will do various things, including routing to your various services. You can see here we've got 4 services. The request will come into the API gateway, and it will then be routed to the correct service. This makes your life much easier as a developer, as you can do the routing in the API gateway and don't need to worry about exposing your servers directly to the internet. The client just hits the API gateway and does all the logic that you need for you. API gateways have a lot of responsibilities. They manage API traffic, protocol translation, caching, load balancing, rate limiting. They can also do the authentication and enforcing security policies, as well as things like circuit breaking, monitoring, logging, billing, and analytics, as well as error handling. So you can see that API gateways can do a lot, and they are super powerful. Let's take a look at a full flow using an API gateway. So the first thing that happens is there's going to be a HTTP request. Generally, your servers are going to be using either REST or GraphQL. So that request is going to come into our API gateway. In the API gateway, the first thing that's going to happen is our parameter validation. And the API gateway is just going to validate that the request looks and is what we are expecting. If it's not, it's just going to reject it. Up next is the allow and deny list. So here it's going to check various IP addresses to see if they have been excluded or not, and follow various security rules that you set up to either allow or deny this particular request. The next step is the authentication and authorization. This is a pretty complicated topic, but essentially we will be using kind of an identity provider to authenticate and then authorize our users and get back the user's roles and what permissions they actually have. We'll cover that in another video. Up next, we have the rate limiting. So again, this is going to check either the IP or the actual user themselves against the current limits that they have and where they are sitting in that bounding. If they've got too many requests already, it's going to reject the request saying you've hit the rate limit. Otherwise, it's going to allow the request to come through. The next step is kind of a combination of both 6 and 7, where we do the dynamic routing and the service discovery. So this is going to be essentially routing the request to the correct service, generally via things like path matching. So obviously in this diagram, if it's a payments request, it's going to go to the payment service rather than the review service. And this service discovery and dynamic routing is how it knows which service to go to. Up next is the protocol translation stage. So again, this is just going to translate any protocols coming in to the ones that we expect on our servers. The request then goes to the correct service and the service responds, and then that data is sent all the way back up through the API gateway and back to the client. So hopefully you can start to see how essential API gateways actually are, and they're responsible for a lot of things. One thing you need to be cautious of is not having the API gateway become a single point of failure. And there's a couple of ways you can handle this. One, you can distribute it geographically over various regions. And this is going to be super important if your application is used across the world. The other thing you can do, obviously, is horizontally deploy the API gateway. So in a single region, have multiple instances of that service so that it doesn't become a single point of failure. In terms of what API gateways are available out there, there's the main ones that are Amazon's AWS API gateway, Google Cloud's API gateway, Azure, and there's also some open source ones via Kong and Type.